Are you saying, or you did testify when you were cross-examined, that those two, these assholes always get away, and pardon my language again, these fucking punks, that he said that because he wanted to interact and meet and invite Trayvon Martin for dinner that night?
Excuse me, Your Honor. That would be speculation.
Sustained.
Are you saying that those words were uttered by the defendant in reference to wanting to meet the victim?
Excuse me, Your Honor. That would be speculation.
Okay,
I'll be glad to rephrase it.
sustained.
Does that not indicate ill will, hatred, and spite against somebody else, sir?
No, it does not.
In your opinion, calling somebody, reference them as, pardon my language, fucking punks?
That is ill will and spite.
It
Correct.
is?
Yes.
Okay.
Are you following him? Yeah. Okay, we don't need you to do that. Sorry, sir, what is your name?
Sir, you were asked by Mr. Romero on behalf of the defendant in terms of whether there was evidence that he had followed him or not. Do you recall being asked that?
Yes, sir.
And do you recall you, in fact, to use Mr. Romero's words, challenged the defendant regarding that? Do you
Yes,
recall
sir.
that?
Yes.
About whether the defendant was following him or not? Do you
Yes,
recall
I
that? Did you hear the word there by the non-emergency operator about whether he was following him or not?
Yes.
And did the operator not tell the defendant not to do that?
In so many words, yes.
Okay. In your interviews and review of Investigator Singleton's interviews,
Would you mind taking that off the screen?
sure. Sorry. In your interview and review of Singleton's interviews, did the defendant, in your interviews of him too, did he ever say he was excited? You want me to rephrase it? I'll be glad to rephrase it. I apologize. In your interview and also your review of Investigator Singleton's interview of the defendant, which you've had an opportunity to do, correct?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Romero asked you about those. And did the defendant ever indicate that he was happy that there were burglaries being committed at Retreat at Twin Lakes?
No, he did not.
Did he ever say he was excited that his neighborhood was getting burglarized?
No, he did not.
In fact, didn't he say this, sir?
950. This is the correct one? Okay. So you live at 1950 Retreat View Circle. Okay. I'm just gonna keep quiet and you tell me the story. You tell me what happened tonight, okay?
Just tonight?
Yeah, or whatever led up to this. Anything you want to tell me about what happened and why it ended up, what it ended up to where this boy got shot. Okay.
The neighborhood has had a lot of crimes. My wife saw our neighbors get broken into and she got scared.
Are you talking about the residents or vehicles?
The residents,
Okay.
while it was occupied. So I decided to start a neighborhood watch program in my neighborhood.
Okay, what is the name of the neighborhood?
Retreat at Twin Lakes.
Now, Investigator Singleton asked the defendant what led up to this in terms of the shooting, correct?
Yes.
And that's how you replied, correct?
Yes, it is.
The watch
Neighborhood watch, okay.
with Wendy Dorval, Sergeant Hertz, Officer Buchanan, and I'm the coordinator. And there's been a few times where I've seen a suspicious person in the neighborhood. We call the police, the non-emergency line, and these guys always get away.
What made them suspicious?
You recall hearing that in terms of Investigator Singleton asking him, the defendant, about what was going on, and he's stating, as he stated there, that they always get away? You
Yes,
recall
sir.
that?
Yes.
Didn't he say that to the non-emergency operator also? But he used more colorful language, pardon my language. He used, "These assholes always get away," correct?
Correct.
And those words were uttered within minutes of the actual shooting, weren't they?
Yes, they were.
I had called before, and the police had come out, but these guys know the neighborhood very well, and they would cut in between buildings and
You're saying these guys, who are these guys?
the people committing the burglaries.
So you've seen more than one person, like, looking suspicious and doing these burglaries?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Now, Investigator Singleton had him clarify when the defendant in that interview on the 26th stated these guys, he had him clarify or describe what he meant, correct?
Yes, sir.
And defendant said the people committing these burglaries, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then to the non-emergency operator earlier that evening, when he spotted Trayvon Martin, he made reference to, using more colorful language, pardon my language, "these fucking punks," correct?
Correct, sir.
So when Mr. O'Mara asked you about profiling, isn't it accurate that he was profiling Trayvon Martin as a criminal? He assumed that he was a criminal that night?
Let me object, Your Honor, that call for speculation.
Sustained as to speculation.
Do you recall Mr. O'Mara asking you about whether he was profiling the defendant, Trayvon Martin?
Yes.
Okay. If somebody were to believe that another person is a criminal, could that be a form of profiling?
Let me object, Your Honor, that would be either speculation or irrelevant.
Overruled.
If I were to believe that you're a criminal and I followed you and did something, wouldn't that be profiling you?
Then I would object based upon improper opinion testimony unless we're opening that door.
He can testify if he knows in his experience as a law enforcement officer.
As long as we're going to his opinions, fine.
Let me make sure it is clear. If I were to believe that somebody was committing a crime, could that not be profiling that person,
Object,
believing?
Your Honor, leading.
Overruled is deleting.
Do you understand my question, sir?
Yes, I do. It could be construed as such, yes. Construed as such, yes.
Your review of the evidence there, was there any indication that Trayvon Benjamin Martin, the young man, I think 20 days past, had just turned 17, was committing a crime that evening, sir?
No, sir.
Was there any evidence that that young man was armed?
No, sir.
You were asked by Mr. O'Mara several times, and I think he made reference to your last interview being a challenged interview, I think. I don't know if you completely agreed with him on that or just agreed to use his terminology for that. Did you agree that that was a challenging interview?
I wouldn't quite classify it as that. However, it could be viewed as a challenging interview based on his view of it.
Okay, his being Mr. O'Mara's?
Yes.
Okay. Let's assume for purposes, let's call it a challenge interview, but you know what I'm referencing to?
Exactly.
Your last interview with the defendant on February 29th.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And Mr. O'Mara asked you whether there was inconsistencies or not.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I want to play certain parts of you where I believe you at least questioned him about whether he had said something inaccurate before or said something different. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
And I want to ask you about these, if I could.
Sounds good. Just let me know if he does anything else. Yeah, we got him on the line. Just let me know if this guy does anything else. Okay. These assholes always get away.
That statement. These assholes.
that?
People that victimized me.
Can't you just tell us from there that a week earlier?
Do you recall you playing that recording for the defendant and asking him about that? Now, that, somebody may refer that to a challenge, but do you recall questioning about that?
Yes, sir. I pointed it out to him.
Okay. And he made reference to, when he made reference to, pardon my language, these assholes as people who commit crimes, correct?
Yes, sir.
Told me not to follow him, and I wasn't following him. I was just going in the same direction he was.
That's following. If you were offended, okay. So you basically wrote it off. I mean,
Right, and I was on the other side.
Now, you were questioning him, pointing out an inconsistency, weren't you not, that he was, the defendant was claiming he was not following him, and you're telling him, that's following him, correct? You recall saying that?
Yes, sir.
Turn is also this. So she's running, and I'm getting out of my car in an instant to make sure I don't lose sight of this guy. That's what it sounds like. Are you following him? Because that's what it sounds like you're doing. That's why he asked you the question. It sounded to the dispatcher likely that you were running, and that's why he asked you that question. Are you following him? And your answer is yes. Okay? But then you get to the other side, and you're concerned about walking past this guy when you've already been chasing him, essentially. And he's telling you to go back to your car, and now you want to pretend, or not pretend, you want us to believe that you're concerned about having a flashlight to move back where you just ran?
you're
Kind
looking
of
for him.
protected him. You know what I'm saying?
Okay, it sounds like you're looking for him.
Do you recall you and Investigator Singleton questioning him about that?
Yes, sir.
About there possibly being an inconsistency based on what he's saying and what the evidence showed?
An inconsistency as far as his acts and his words,
Yes, sir.
to clarify.
Right. And by the way, while we're at this point, Mr. O'Mara asked you about videotaping. You recall that you had questioned the defendant about videotaping, and you showed him the victim's camera that was at the scene near where his body was. You recall that?
Yes, sir.
And you stated, I believe, in direct and in cross-examination that you were bluffing him. You were telling him that the victim had potentially videotaped the whole thing?
At that point, yes, it was a bluff.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you knew that not to be true, correct?
At that point, yes.
Okay, all right. And my point is, and the defendant made a comment like, oh, I hope to God it was videotaped. You recall that?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay. Now, Mr. O'Mara asked you about stores and other places that have videotapes out there.
Yes.
Correct? Now, the defendant, I believe you've already testified, was head of the neighborhood watch, correct?
Yes,
And
sir.
had lived in that neighborhood for a while, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so he would have been aware whether there was videotaping or not in any of those buildings, correct?
I would assume so, yes.
Okay. And I know you weren't there when it happened, but you would agree that the interaction between the defendant and the victim in this case, the defendant was aware of whether the victim, before he got shot, took out the video and videotaped the defendant, correct?
Object,
Would
Your
know
Honor.
that.
I would object, that would be speculation.
Sustained.
Was there any evidence that the victim, before he got shot, said, hold on, before you shoot me, let me take out my camera and take a picture of you as you're shooting me?
No, there was none.
Was there any evidence that the victim, as the defendant was following him, said, hold on, I'm going to take a photograph of you so there'll be a record before you shoot me that you're following me?
Object, Your Honor, that was asked and answered.
Overruled.
Was there any evidence that the victim, as the defendant was following him, said, hold on, stop right there, let me take a photograph of you or let me videotape you before you shoot me or before you're following me and then shoot me?
No, sir, no.
And so when Mr. O'Mara asked you about whether the defendant knew that or not, he would have known that, correct?
I would assume so, yes, sir.
So he basically knew you were bluffing, is what I'm getting at.
Objection,
Based
Your
on-
Honor. That would be speculation.
Sustained.
I'll be glad. Let me play another recording for you if I could, sir.
That you're concerned about having a flashlight to move back where you just ran?
You're
Kind
looking
of
for him.
protected him. You know what I'm saying?
Okay, it sounds like you're looking for him.
You brought a flashlight with you.
Yes, ma'am.
You wanted to be able to see him.
You want to catch him? You want to catch the bad
It
guy?
doesn't, that's.
Fucking punk can't get away. Listen, we're outside that interrogation room, okay? We are in a whole different area right here, okay? This is where, you know what I mean?
You were questioning him about what he had said, about the evidence, correct?
Yes, sir.
Is that what you were doing there?
Yes, sir.
Can you recall? At what point is segregation happened? Prior to you shooting him, he was on you, correct? Okay. And you were able to reach into your holster. You shot him at point blank range. He was on top of you, right? Yes, sir. And although that young, nobody came out to help you, and I can't pinpoint where you were smothered. That's the problem I'm having. And nobody's saying they saw him smothering you. People were saying they saw you on top of you, but they didn't see about the smothering part. So,
When we're listening to the screaming, it doesn't sound like it's a hesitation for screaming. It sounds like it's continuous. I mean, if someone who knows, it's going to stop. But we don't hear it stop.
we don't hear.
You recall you and Investigator Singleton challenged, to use Mr. O'Mara's words, challenging him about whether he was being smothered or not?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can we play? A moment, Your Honor. You recall watching on direct and then on cross-examination, I believe it was on direct, I apologize, it was, being asked questions about the videotaping, the reenactment
Yes,
that
sir.
occurred on the 27th. You recall that between the defendant, where you took him back out to the scene? Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You were present for that, is that correct?
Yes, I was.
Okay. And do you recall that at some point the defendant walking, as he's walking, and he's walking the route where he claimed he went? Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And do you recall him at some point saying that he went to look for an address and there were no addresses to the left, that because those were the back of the buildings? Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I'm going to try to key to this point specifically, but do you recall?
I think I told the operator that.
I'm sorry.
And he said, are you following? For a street sign. Right. So I got out of my car and I started walking. Go ahead. I was still on the phone with non-emergency and I started walking. Okay. Down this way. And because I didn't see a street sign here, but I knew if I went straight through, that's Retreat View Circle, and I could give him an address, because he said, just give me the address of the house you're in front of. And there's no address, because this is the back of the houses. So,
Do you recall that testimony, sir?
Yes, sir, I do.
Sir, do you recall?
I said, I don't know an address. And then they asked me where he went, and what direction he went in, and I said, I don't know. And then I thought to get out and look for a street.
Right there on that corner lived Miss Lauer. You recall that?
Yes, sir.
You get back in the photographs. I want to show you a photograph of the front of Miss Lauer's residence. Isn't there a numerical address right there in the front of her house?
Yes, there is.
is in her address 1211. Sir?
Yes, sir.
Okay, how do I get back there? So, as the defendant, no, you stay right there on that photograph. So, the defendant in that reenactment, when he's pointing at all the back of these houses, where he's claiming he doesn't have an address, there's an address right there staring at him. Isn't that true, sir?
Yes, there is.
That would be leading. This is still redirect.
I'll be glad to rephrase the question. When a defendant turns and points on video to this side where he's saying there's no address because it's the back of the house, right to the right, what is there? Is there a house there with an address?
Yes, there is.
We go to the aerial exhibit. For the record, that was State's Exhibit 33. Just number 1. And let me show you State's Exhibit number 1. And I'm going to put a close-up of part of that. For the record, State's Exhibit number 1, a scenario photograph of the retreat of Twin Lakes, correct?
Yes, sir.
And as you pointed out when you used Mr. Romero's words, challenging the defendant in that interview, you pointed out there was only 3 actual streets in the whole neighborhood, correct?
Yes, sir.
And this street the defendant claims he did not know is Twin Tree Lane, which is the main entrance that you come in and out of that retreat of Twin Lakes. And right here, I'm pointing to is Ms. Lauer's address, correct?
Yes, sir.
So the defendant, when in that interview, claims he did not know this street and didn't happen to see the address here, but specifically did not know this street, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Thank you, Your Honor. You recall also on cross-examination, defense counsel asking you about inconsistencies or consistencies, correct?
Correct.
Do you recall the defendant in the interview that he gave you and Investigator Singleton stating that after he had shot Trayvon Martin said, oh, or something, put his hands up, correct? Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
And do you recall that he then stated that Trayvon Martin somehow fell on the ground face first? You recall that?
Yes, sir.
And do you recall the defendant stating that he put his arms out, correct? Do you
Correct.
recall him saying that?
Yes, sir.
Now, sir, if I may approach the clerk. Do you recall, sir, that one of the first, in fact, the first person that actually came out before the officer was a person named Manalo, Joe Manalo?
Yes, sir. Jonathan.
I'm sorry.
Jonathan
Manalo, I
Manalo,
apologize. And may I approach the witness, Your Honor? Showing you State's Exhibit 77. Do you recall that he took some photographs out there?
Yes, I remember those, yes.
And one of them was State's Exhibit 77?
Yes, sir.
And may I publish that to the jury, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
And you recall in that photograph the victim's hands being underneath his body?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Could someone say that that was inconsistent with the defendant's statements that his hands were straight out, that he had put his hands out?
That positioning, yes.
I'm sorry.
That positioning as seen there, yes, it is.
Talk to this side.
In that interview that you conducted, or Investigator Singleton conducted, the defendant didn't say, I put his hands out, and then after I put his hands out, I put him back in, did he?
No, he did not.
I think in cross-examination, you were asked something about exaggeration. Do you recall being asked about that?
Yes, sir.
And do you recall, I think either you uttered it or Mr. O'Mara uttered it on behalf of the defendant, exaggeration. Do you recall what that was about?
Pertaining to the defendant's statements,
You felt he was exaggerating certain parts of it?
among other things.
Did you feel, I can't lead you, so
Okay.
did you feel in terms of exaggeration, what did you mean when you said that he was exaggerating parts of his interview?
How I felt, okay, based on,
Okay, no, what I'm getting is inconsistent. I want to give you, I don't want to,
okay,
you were asked specifically about exaggeration. Did you feel he had exaggerated the manner in which he was hit?
yes, sir, yes, sir.
Regarding your interview with the defendant on February 29th, was your investigation still ongoing?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Had you, at that point, and even further, had you gotten any results back from FDLE regarding the analysis done of the clothing or anything else regarding that, sir?
No, sir, I had not.
Had you gotten the medical examiner's report or examination in terms of final findings regarding that?
No, sir, I had
Had
not.
you gotten any results regarding possible DNA?
No, sir.
Had you gotten any results in terms of the ballistics, the firearms, the trajectory, the stippling, whatever evidence regarding that?
No, sir.
Had you spoken to a girl or lady that was speaking to the victim on the phone at the time or right before the time that this murder happened?
No, sir.
Had you analyzed the phone records and the conversations between the victim, Trayvon Martin, and this lady that he was speaking to? Her name's Rachel Gentile.
No, sir.
Had you seen the 7-Eleven video?
No, sir, I had not.
You also did, obviously, reports in this case, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in some of those reports, did you in some way write down some inconsistencies, what you felt were some inconsistencies based on the statements that the defendant had given you?
Concerns of mine about his statements, correct? Yes, sir.
Okay. You mentioned at some point or you were asked about the size of the individuals, correct? Mr. Martin and the defendant, correct?
The physical sizes?
Yeah, I'm sorry, the victim.
Yes.
And I think, did you describe, I apologize if I got it wrong, did you describe the victim as a skinny kid or something to that effect?
Yes, sir, I did.
Would you classify the defendant, when you came into contact, as a skinny kid?
Would I classify the defendant as
Yeah,
skinny?
as a skinny kid?
No, sir.
Would it be fair to say the bottom line, sir, is that after February 29th and after a later date, the investigation was turned over to somebody else, is that correct?
As of what date, sir?
After that interview, at a later date in March, the investigation was turned over to another agency?
Yes, sir.
So, Mr. O'Mara asked you about phone calls that you had, telephone conversations with the defendant, do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Was your intent to eventually, if you could, attempt to interview the defendant again and challenge him, I guess to use Mr. O'Mara's words?
Absolutely, yes, sir.
If I can have a moment, Your Honor.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't have any further questions.
Thank you, and you recross?
Oh, yes, Your Honor. Let's now go through some of the areas that Mr. Delarianda talked about. Starting with, and again, I'm going to give a blanket apology for using some curse words, but when they exist in the case, they exist in the courtroom. So Mr. Delarianda was wondering whether or not you would use the term assholes in inviting somebody over for dinner. I think he said probably not. However, would you agree that if you were talking to somebody about something that you've used the word assholes probably thousands of times in your life?
I have used it,
Okay.
yes.
And sometimes it's just used as just a slang term, would you agree?
Yes, sir.
When Mr. Del Rionda said those words to you, I think he said assholes, didn't he?
And that's
Yeah.
approximate. Yeah.
Did you hear my client say that word assholes on the tape? We can play it again.
I heard him say it.
Okay. He didn't say it with the screeching voice that Mr. Del Rionda did he?
No, sir.
He just sort of said assholes, right?
Yes, sir.
Did that, the way he said it, not the way Mr. Del Rionda just said it, let's put that aside for a minute and speak more importantly about the way my client said the word assholes. Did that give you any cause for concern as to the way he said it?
No, sir.
Didn't show any ill will or hatred or spite when he said these assholes always get away? Did it?
If I may, not towards the individual, it seemed like more of a generalization.
Sure. Right. And of course, he was generalizing a little bit, correct? Because you know from your investigation that he was a bit frustrated that his neighborhood was being assailed by burglars, right?
That's how I
You
interpret
knew
it.
that.
Yes.
You knew that, as a matter of fact, you investigated and found out that a person, Emmanuel Burgess, was arrested 2 weeks before this event, a young black male, for having burglarized several homes in the neighborhood, right?
Yes, sir.
Late teens, tall, thin, just been arrested, right?
Yes, sir.
Sentenced to 5 years in prison for having burglarized a bunch of homes both in Retreat View Circle and outside, but still in your jurisdiction, right?
I wasn't involved in that, but yes, sir.
But you found that out, and looking into everything that you were looking into to see what's going on in the neighborhood, you knew not only had Emmanuel Burgess been arrested 2 weeks before for burglarizing, but that there were a lot of other burglaries in that same neighborhood, right?
Yes, sir.
Were you concerned that he was concerned about that? Did that cause you any concern that somebody who involved themselves in protecting the community, being on neighborhood watch, would be concerned about a bunch of burglaries in the neighborhood?
Him being concerned, if I may, is one thing. As far as my personal feelings towards his actions the night of, is a little bit different.
Sure, and we'll get to that in just a moment.
Okay.
But talking specifically to the issue of calling them these assholes always get away, were you concerned that he used the word assholes?
No, sir.
And you've used it yourself?
Yes, I have.
In not any necessarily derogatory way, correct? Just as sort of a slang term?
It tends to be more towards derogatory, sir.
So ever for guys walking into the squad room, it's about dinner time, you go, okay, what are you assholes doing for dinner? Anything like that?
Personally, no.
Really?
Not that. I see what you're saying, but it could be viewed that way.
Okay. Just like when you use the word shit, right? Oh shit, he's running.
Yes, sir.
Any concern with that slang term?
No.
Don't suggest that that evidences any hatred or ill will on his behalf, do you?
As I interpret that, that was said with the infliction as a sense of urgency,
Yeah.
as if something was happening bad.
Right, because he was just running away, correct?
Yes.
And then let's talk about fucking punks. Were you here for John Guy's opening? Did you hear it?
No, sir.
Oh. When Mr. Zimmerman said the words fucking punks, did he say it in a screeching, loud, aggressive voice the way Mr. Del Rionda just recounted it to you?
No, sir.
Do you know why Mr. Del Rionda yelled it at you?
To stress a point, to emphasize.
Right. But you heard it on tape, correct?
Yes, sir.
And how is it said on tape?
This said as more as a matter of factly, as far as these assholes always get away. It's or fucking function.
Right. Might show some frustration, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Frustration based upon the fact that other people in the neighborhood who have burglarized the place seem to get away on occasion, right?
Yes.
And in that sense, you said that there was no evidence that Trayvon Martin was doing anything wrong, correct?
None whatsoever.
You don't know that, though, correct?
No, I do not.
Right? You know that whatever he may have been planning to do just wasn't completed, correct?
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. There was no evidence to suggest that at all.
Matter of fact, there was a type of a tool found in the area where Trayvon Martin may have been hiding, wasn't there?
Approximately 5-6 days after the investigation of the scene, yes.
When we went back and you looked in the bushes and you found, what was it?
It was a piece of an awning belonging to, it was, I believe it was a piece of a window, piece of hardware, basically. It looked like a Slim Jim.
Slim Jim. And what's a Slim Jim?
Slim Jim's a device used to go ahead and jimmy locks on vehicles primarily.
To break into a vehicle.
Yes, sir.
And that was found a few days after this event.
Yes, sir.
Not particularly tied to this event by you, but it was there, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
In the bushes just off of one of the residences, correct?
In the bushes behind Jonathan Manolo's residence.
So, would you suggest that the focus be on how Mr. Zimmerman stated the words "fucking punks" as opposed to the way Mr. Guy did in opening or Mr. Delaround just did in your questioning?
I can't speak for Mr. Guys, but Mr. Villarreal, it was different.
Okay. Now, he also asked you that you were questioning Mr. Zimmerman on the fact that he was following Trayvon Martin, correct?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Zimmerman said,
Words along,
he said yes, right? He said, wait a minute, were you following him? And in the interview, his word was yes, right?
in one of the interviews,
He
yes.
acknowledged to you that he was following him at one point, correct?
Yes, sir.
Anything wrong with following somebody like that? Let me ask you this way, anything illegal?
Objection, I'd ask that he be allowed
I'm
to
sorry.
answer the question.
I'll let him answer that one.
Repeat it, please.
Anything, did you think that there was anything wrong with him following him to see where he was going?
Legally speaking, no.
Okay. Matter of fact, it was, and you heard the non-emergency call, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And it was twice on that the non-emergency operator asked Mrs. Zimmerman, tell me if he does anything else,
Yes, I believe that was said.
right?
Yes.
Does that indicate that he wants him to keep an eye on him?
Yes, sir.
And you said following him is not legally improper, correct?
That's not illegal. No,
Even
sir.
approaching somebody is not legally improper, is it?
That's open for interpretation.
Tell me what crime you believe would occur if I were to walk up to you on the street and say, hi.
In that manner, none whatsoever.
How about, what are you doing here?
None whatsoever.
How about, get the hell out of here?
None whatsoever.
How about, I don't like the way you're dressed. I don't like the fact that you have gray on. Get out of my face.
That could be construed as confrontational.
Sure, but is that
Not illegal.
a crime?
No, sir.
And when this operator who said twice, tell me if he does anything else, then says, are you following him? What does Mrs. Zimmerman say?
He says yes.
And in your investigation, is there anything at all to suggest at that time that Mr. Zimmerman continued to follow Mr. Martin?
At which point, sir?
At the point that the officer said, or the 911 non-emergency operator said, we don't need you to do that, and Mr. Zimmerman said, okay.
I would say yes, there was.
And what evidence would you have?
His end location.
I'm sorry?
His end location, the location where the incident ultimately ended.
Okay, so the fact that, may I approach the witness, Your Honor? clarification purposes, I'm going to go with witness stated here at 139. Because you know the event started where?
The event, as far as I'm concerned, started off that map.
Okay. I'm talking about the physical altercation. I apologize. My understanding from, well, what's your understanding as to when Mr. Zimmerman got to this area, what path he took?
Understand?
Please do.
Could you face forward?
Yes. Okay. My understanding of the interpretation is he's coming this way, he walks. So I got a pointer. Okay. He walks, per his statement, all the way over here. He says he doesn't see him. Okay, and the altercation, physical altercation started right there approximately.
Okay, great, thank you. So, with that as context, then, do you know exactly where Mr. Zimmerman was when the non-emergency operator said, we don't need you to do that?
Based on his statement, he was at his vehicle, which would have been, I believe, off of that or wherever he parked it.
Based on his statement, he was at his vehicle, which would have been, I believe.
Wherever he parked it on Twin Trees.
It's your understanding of the investigation that Mrs. Zimmerman was at his vehicle when the officer said, we don't need you to do that?
That was when he was exiting his vehicle. That's my
Okay.
understanding, yeah.
Okay, and then how many seconds went forward as he was walking before that conversation occurred?
Objection.
I'd have
Those
to,
facts, not an evidence, just walking.
Sustained.
How many seconds? You heard the tape where you can hear him getting out of the car, correct?
well, I heard the sound of the door being opened, which I interpreted that.
Then he got out of the car,
Yes.
right? And then you know that he was walking in some direction because he said to the officer in response to, are you following him? He said yes, right?
Objection is the facts, not an evidence, walking, assuming a fact, not an evidence.
Rephrase your question.
You know that he was following him because he told the non-emergency operator that he was, right?
Yes, sir.
And you know from the conversation that Mrs. Zimmerman indicated to the non-emergency operator that he had cut between the buildings, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so, if I might approach again, so just so we're clear with what he just testified to, he parked his car somewhere in this area, correct?
Correct.
And then, go ahead,
Back around here somewhere.
right?
So I'd have to hear it again, obviously.
Could
but
you face forward?
Yeah, I'd have to hear it again, obviously, but somewhere very shortly thereafter leaving his car, that's when it was asked, are you following him?
Okay.
And he said yes.
And Mrs. Zimmerman indicated that Mr. Martin had gone between the buildings. He was out of sight, correct?
Yes.
Yet, you testified a moment ago that pursuant to Mr. Zimmerman's statement, he had gone down to Retreat View Circle, correct?
Well, that was his statement, but as far as him having a visual on when he might have got out of the vehicle, I really don't know. I can't say, it wasn't there. But he could have seen him at any point which way he was running. Am I making myself clear? I mean,
Well, the jury can decide that. I'll try to walk
Okay.
you through a little bit
Yeah.
more. So my question a little while ago was whether or not you had any evidence to support any contention that Mr. Zimmerman continued to follow Trayvon Martin after being told not to. Do you have any evidence to support that?
I would answer, I have information, yes, that there was, just based on where we located Trayvon and the fact that the altercation happened after his conversation. That's my interpretation.
Let me
that
ask it
there
this
was
way.
some
Let me ask it this way. Do you have anything to contradict Mrs. Zimmerman's statement that he walked the rest of the way to Retreat View Circle and was coming back towards his car when the interaction, whatever it was, between Trayvon Martin and him occurred?
Nothing tangible, no.
Go intangible on us then. So what do you mean nothing tangible? What do you have, if anything?
And the circumstances, the totality of the whole thing that I'm looking at, as I interpreted it, when he says follow, walking behind, trying to find a direction, I construe that as follow. He was trying to do something in the same direction where Trayvon was going.
He was trying
and
to see where he was.
As far as the word follow, as my report may indicate, I mean, it's, but it's open for interpretation.
And as your report indicates, there's nothing to suggest that Trayvon Martin went straight down Retreat View Circle, towards Retreat View Circle. He went between the buildings, correct?
According to statements made by Mrs. Zimmerman. According to statements made by your client, yeah.
And of course, all of those statements, including Mr. Zimmerman saying that he was attacked by Trayvon Martin coming from that area as well, correct?
Correct.
Anything to contradict that?
No, sir.
You understood from your conversation with Wendy Dorval, your knowledge of Neighborhood Watch, that if a crime is occurring, that you ought to call 911, correct?
I don't recall talking to Wendy Dorval about it, but I may have, but yes, that's what you do.
So if it's just a concern, like a suspicious person, you dial non-emergency, correct?
Yes, sir.
And if it's an actual crime occurring, you dial 911.
If those are the instructions, yes.
And which one did Mrs. Zimmerman dial?
The non-emergency.
Evidencing, would you agree that he was not concerned that a crime was actually occurring, just that he was concerned about somebody being where they may not supposed to be?
Yes, sir.
And in your experience and knowledge, did you think it was inappropriate for Mrs. Zimmerman to call non-emergency when he saw Trayvon Martin hanging out between two homes, in the rain, in the dark?
Objection, as he calls for speculation on his part.
Sustained.
You want to ask you for
Rephrase
his,
it.
okay. In your opinion, I don't want you to speculate as to what, but in your opinion, was that an appropriate, from law enforcement experience, was that an appropriate occurrence for him to contact non-emergency based upon seeing somebody who he didn't know at night in the rain between two homes, not walking away, just standing there?
My objection is to assume that those facts are accurate and truthful.
The jury,
Okay, you can answer the question.
That would be reasonable to
Reasonable,
call
correct?
non-emergency.
but in
Yes.
fact, if you were driving an unmarked car past that, at that precise moment, and saw Trayvon Martin there, standing between two buildings at night in the rain, not moving, maybe even looking into a window, would you have stopped and talked to him?
Not just based on his presence, no, I would not.
And why not?
He might live there.
But the question is, would you stop and ask him?
Not just based on what you observed, no.
You agree that police, at least, are supposed to look into situations that might be suspicious?
If brought to the attention by a citizen, yes.
I'm sorry?
If brought to the attention by a citizen, such
Oh.
as George Zimmerman, yes, we are obligated to.
So you wouldn't do it on your own?
If on routine patrol, I can't say, maybe.
Mr. De Leonda asked you that if you had found out whether or not Trayvon Martin was armed, correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you also realize from the investigation, presuming for a moment that Mrs. Zimmerman's story is completely accurate, and that he did in fact receive the injuries to the back of his head at Trayvon Martin's hands, that Trayvon Martin was smashing his head, hitting his head against concrete, correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you consider that to have armed himself with the concrete?
Yes, sir.
So, though he may not have been armed when he was walking, he certainly armed himself with something that could cause great bodily injury or death by hitting the head against concrete, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in the challenge interview, and Then we go back and forth as to whether or not it was an interview with challenge, an interview for information, but again, for these purposes, calling it a challenge interview. Mrs. Zimmerman stated to you that his concern was that there were people who are out there, quote, victimizing the neighborhood, right?
Yes, that's what he said, yes.
And do you believe that his basis for that thought or even that feeling was well-founded? Let me ask it this way. How many burglaries had occurred in that neighborhood in the past 4 or 5 months?
I don't have the exact numbers, sir.
Would you consider it to be a rash of burglaries?
It would depend how many we're talking about. I don't know.
Well, limiting to the extent of what you looked into. I know you looked into Emmanuel Burgess, and he was arrested a couple of weeks before. And
Yes,
there were
sir.
other burglaries that you were aware of, correct, within the last few months before this event?
I'd have to refresh my memory as far as the number, as to consider it a rash of burglaries. To consider it a rash of burglaries or a crime spree, but I guess in his mind, yes.
And of course, burglaries are what occur when the people are not at home, correct?
Repeat, please.
A burglary that we're talking about now are those where the people are not at home when the crime occurs, correct?
Correct.
It's called burglary of an occupied dwelling or a home invasion when somebody's home, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that happened here as well, didn't it?
Yes, sir.
A woman, and you were aware in your investigation that a woman and her, I think, 4-month-old child had to hide in a bedroom closet while 2 guys downstairs took out her TV, laptop, and other items.
Yes, sir.
And that was only weeks before February 26th of 2012, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it may have been months before, a couple of months before, if I said weeks.
It had occurred, though.
Concerning the videotaping, and I can put you back to the tape, my memory, and tell me if I'm wrong, was that when you were bluffing Mr. Zimmerman about the idea that Trayvon Martin may have had a phone, that was videotaping things. You certainly did it in as believable a way as you could, remember?
Yes, sir.
You know how to get it across to him, correct?
Yes,
Did he
sir.
seem smug, as though he already had made this decision? Well, you can try and bluff me if you want, but I know he didn't have his phone out. Was there any of that came across to you?
No, sir.
In this challenge interview, was that exactly what you were looking for to see?
Partially, yes.
And none of that came across to you, did it?
None at all. No.
Matter of fact, he seemed quite interested in the fact that there may have been a videotape, correct?
Yes, he did.
Didn't he also say that he, maybe without his knowing, he'd hoped that the homeowners association had put up another video camera somewhere in that back area?
Yes, he did.
So he actually said to you, not only do I hope that Trayvon Martin was somehow taping this, or since he had the phone out or whatever, that somehow maybe it was on video. And he said, what was his words? Thank God, I hope he was videotaping it.
Words to those effect, yes.
And he even said to you, well, maybe it's being videotaped from somewhere else. That maybe homeowners association had put up a camera going right down that dog walk that I wasn't aware of, or for that matter, any one of the dozen neighbors may have had a video camera out, correct?
Yes, sir.
Didn't he also indicate that he even hoped that maybe the one person who had come out, who we now know to be John Good, that maybe he had videotaped it?
I don't know if he verbalized that, but he seemed to be very open to having something videoed. Yes. He seemed to be very elated in the prospect that there was some sort of videotape.
Hoping that that would actually document what happened that night.
Yes, sir.
Another challenge that you did, just a moment for my own, another challenge. At least I didn't do a complete pirouette. And I said, excuse me first. Thank you. Another challenge that you did to Mr. Zimmerman was concerning this question about the hands over the face, correct? Because
Yes,
that was
sir.
a concern of yours, right?
Yes, sir.
As he had said, he placed his hand over my face at one point. I really thought he was suffocating me. Words like that, correct?
Yes, sir.
And yet, on the screaming of the 911, there wasn't a great deal of muffling. Would you agree?
No, sir, there was not, yes.
And had there been muffling, then it would have even been perfectly coordinated with what Mrs. Zimmerman told you, because then the suffocating, muffling would have shown up on the tape. But in this case, it didn't, correct?
Correct.
You would agree that the screams are from one person, correct?
Based on interpreted, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that they were just that, screams, stop, scream, stop, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I think you said that you also believe Mr. Zimmerman may have exaggerated as to the number of times getting hit, correct?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Delaround brought that up again as an exaggeration, right?
Possible, yes.
Yeah, I think we talked about it as to how it might be perceived when you're the one getting hit, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. May also be that you perceive getting smothered even when somebody has your hand on their broken nose?
Possibly, yes.
Okay. May have actually had a hand on his mouth or nose, but just not enough to interfere with Mr. Zimmerman's continued screams for help, correct?
Correct.
So even though you challenged him on that to try and come up with an answer, and he told you, I don't know, right?
Correct.
Did you change his story at that point, realizing that now you got him on a fact, and just say, well, actually I turned over and I was screaming the other way, and that's what? Did he do any of that?
No, sir, you're not.
He just basically said, I think he had his hands on my head, right?
Yes, sir.
I think he was trying to stop me from
Yes, sir.
breathing, and it hurt.
Yes, sir.
And just so we're clear in that regard, would you agree that there may have been some screams muffled enough so that they simply didn't show up on the tape?
There could have been, possibly.
With that last challenge, this, call it the suffocation challenge, was there anything in that challenge of Mrs. Zimmerman that you thought then was problematic? The way he answered it?
No, sir.
Now let's talk about the video where Mr. Zimmerman seems, maybe for the second time, to not notice Miss Lauer's number on the right-hand side, correct?
Yes, sir.
And as he's walking you through it, again, voluntarily doing what you wanted him to do, right?
Yes, sir.
He sort of looked over and he said, I didn't see anything here, correct?
Yes, sir.
And obviously, had he looked to his right, if he had been in that correct spot, and had he not been blocked by the tree that the jury has seen from another picture, then he might have seen, or could have seen, Miss Lauer's numbers, correct?
Yes, sir.
Would he have seen them if he had just started walking by and just got past Miss Lauer's, the front door right there? Is there any number on the side of that building?
No, sir.
Okay. So if I might carefully approach your arm again. Just so we're clear on, again, States 139. This is Miss Lauer's, and front door here, number is sort of on this side.
Yes, sir. Facing the street.
Right, facing out this way.
Yes, sir.
So if Mr. Zimmerman had gotten to this point, or was looking around, doing whatever he was doing, as soon as he got to somewhere in this point, he would not have a line of sight to
I'm going
those.
to object to misstating what Mr. Zimmerman said on video as to where he was when he didn't or did see the address.
Okay.
I'll clear that up.
Rephrase your question.
No one could see the numbers once you get past this, correct?
Correct.
And you do agree that Mrs. Zimmerman was trying to do the best he could to acknowledge what he was doing in the recreation, correct?
By appearances, yes.
Right. He seemed to be doing everything that he could to explain to you what he was doing?
Yes, sir.
As he was doing this, was it a situation where you just sort of letting him run with it, or were you asking him any questions along the way?
I believe some questions were asked for
Yeah.
clarification.
Sure. And when he said, as he's walking with Miss Lowers to the right of him, and he's sort of looking this way, the car is somewhere near where he said he parked his, right?
From what I recall, yes.
And you had the non-emergency call already known by the time you did the recreation, so you knew an idea of the series of events, correct?
Yes, sir.
You knew that he had said that I'd gotten out of the car about here, right?
Yes, sir.
And that he was walking down that road, or doing something, walking, running, jogging, whatever he was doing. He was ambulating down that pathway, correct?
Yes, sir.
That he sort of looked over and said, I couldn't see any numbers, and he looked to his left, correct?
From what I recall, yes.
Yeah, did anyone ever think at that point to go, excuse me, if you back up and look over this way, there's a number, why didn't you look at that number?
If it wasn't mentioned, no.
Did you ever do that afterwards?
No.
Did that seem, in the context of what he was trying to explain that happened to him that night, that ended up with what it ended up with, that that was some type of active deception to you?
I didn't interpret it as such, no.
Okay. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense in your mind that he couldn't remember the name of the street, correct?
Correct.
Like you said, there's only 3 there, correct?
Correct.
Did you, and you even questioned him about that, right?
Yes, sir.
But did that show to you to be some active deception on his part?
The fact that he couldn't remember the 3 streets could have possibly, yes, it did raise flags and concerns.
Okay. And did that lead to any concern? I mean, you addressed it in this confrontation interview, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you were okay with what he responded?
That's all I could do is be okay with it. And that's...
Okay. And then you were questioning about a number of things concerning the investigation. So I want to talk to you about some of those.
Okay.
The medical examiner's report. You had a chance to review that, correct?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And the medical examiner's report and its findings were consistent with Mrs. Zimmerman's story, were they not?
Yes, sir.
Okay. As far as how he shot him, correct? Where he shot him?
Yes, sir.
And the distance between the muzzle of the gun and the clothing, correct?
Yes, sir.
And also that there was a gap of a few inches between the clothing and Mr. Martin's chest, correct?
Yes, sir.
Evidencing that though the muzzle of the gun was up against the chest, up against the shirt, that the shirt was not up against the chest, that there was a few inch difference,
Yes, sir.
right? And didn't that support the contention that Mr. Martin was hanging over Mr. Zimmerman, his shirt coming forward when the shot was fired,
It did.
right?
Yes.
Because had he been standing up, as I am now, the shirt would be up against the chest, probably, right?
Probably, yes,
And
sir.
if I lean over, my shirt is going to fall apart from my chest a few inches, and that seems to be how it was, correct?
Yes, sir.
The medical examiner's report, however, does not support a contention, an allegation, that Mr. Zimmerman pressed that gun against Trayvon Martin's chest before he fired it, does it?
Not from the one
Matter
I
of fact, the known evidence completely contradicts that type of a suggestion, doesn't it?
From what I understand, yes.
So no pressing of the gun against the chest, was there?
Not based on evidence that I've read, no.
And you saw the 7-Eleven video since, right? Though I think Mr. Delaronda suggested you didn't have it then. You've certainly seen it since.
I don't think I viewed the video itself. I think that was bought after I was,
No, but have you seen it?
I've seen stills, still photos.
And these stills that you saw show Trayvon Martin in it?
Yes, sir.
And show him the way he appeared that night?
Yes, sir.
So when you say that certainly in the autopsy photograph that you wanted to show Mr. Zimmerman, which again was part of the challenge interview, correct?
Yes, sir.
You hit him with something sort of emotional and to ground him that he had caused the death of this person?
It was graphic, yes, sir.
And that's the purpose of it, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But the picture of Mr. Martin at 7-Eleven, would you agree that that shows somebody at his height, whatever that might have been, in the shoes and the hoodie, and wearing the outfit that he was wearing, that he did not look in the 7-Eleven video to be the skinny kid that you showed the picture of to Mrs. Zimmerman, correct?
Correct.
Much larger looking individual?
I would agree with you, yes.
Okay. My height or so? I'm
Correct.
6'2", right?
Yes.
If I was wearing a hoodie and had his shoes on, correct?
Yes.
When you talk about relative size, although I think you said that Mrs. Zimmerman, not today, but back then, wouldn't come across as a skinny kid, correct?
Correct.
When you look at the actual height differential, there was quite a height differential, wasn't there?
Yes, there was.
And therefore a reach differential?
Yes, sir.
You know what that means, right?
Yes, I do.
What is that?
The reach is measured arm to arm, sideways.
Come and have a moment, Your Honor.
Thank you. Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Let's start at the very end. Would you agree that after somebody dies, they don't get taller?
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Have you ever heard of when people die that they get taller?
Oh, no, sir.
So you're not disputing if the medical examiner were to say they measured him on a table that Trayvon Martin was only 5'11". You're not disputing that, are you?
No, sir.
I mean, you're not trying to tell the jury that after Trayvon Martin died, he grew to be 6'2",
No,
are
sir.
you?
No.
I mean, have you ever heard of that? Somebody dying and growing taller?
No, sir.
Okay. And by the way, Mr. O'Mara asked you, I want to make sure I understood your answer. Are you saying that in Seminole County, it's against the law for somebody to wear a hoodie at night?
Objection, Your Honor. That is a mischaracterization of the evidence and my question.
Okay, I think you need to rephrase it because you started.
Are you saying that it's against the law for a person to wear a hoodie at night?
No, sir. No, sir, I'm not.
I believe in your investigation and your interview with the defendant that he had a phone, correct, that night?
The
When he
defendant?
when he observed the victim, Trayvon Martin? The defendant had a cell phone,
Yes, he
right?
did, yes.
You didn't find any evidence that the defendant, when he's claiming he's seen the suspicious activity, videotaped or photographed the suspicious activity that he claims the victim was doing.
Let me object, Your Honor.
Was there any evidence of that?
Just a second, what's the objection?
Outside the scope of recross, unless we're opening up that new area.
No, overruled, it's not opening it up.
You were asked about videos, right? Was there any evidence to indicate that when the defendant claimed that the victim was committing a crime or was about to commit a crime, that he videotaped it since he had a phone with the ability to videotape or take photographs? Did he ever do that?
No, sir.
You were asked about this item that was found behind some bushes. Isn't it true that was part of an awning that Mr. Manalo had there?
It's part of his house, yeah.
Right? There was
Awning,
no
yes,
evidence
sir.
to indicate that was used as a tool or a Slim Jim or anything like that.
None whatsoever.
And you would agree that an expert, or if he's qualified as an expert, a medical examiner or assistant medical examiner would be better qualified as to the findings that he made versus you saying what he said?
Yes, sir.
You would defer to a medical examiner, would you not?
Absolutely.
Mr. Romero asked you some questions about the burglaries that were being committed out there at Retreat Twin Lakes that you investigated or determined there was some, right?
Yes, sir.
And that the defendant had made calls about them, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I think Mr. Romero referred to it as a black male, right? At least one of them he referred to. Did you know whether the other individuals he had called on were black males or not?
From what I recall researching, yes.
Say it again.
From what I recall researching then, yes, they were.
Mr. Romero asked you a bunch of questions about the word, pardon my language, asshole. And did I understand you correctly to say that that is a derogatory term in describing somebody or referring to somebody?
In my opinion, yes.
And Mr. Romero asked you about the words or that the defendant uttered on on February 26th at around 7:10 before he followed the victim. Do you recall him specifically under his breath saying, pardon my language, these fucking punks? Do you recall that's the way he uttered it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, you read any comics?
Have I what?
Do you read any comics?
Comics.
Comics,
No,
no?
no,
You know
I
how
don't.
they have a little caption where they have like a little bubble because they kind of, what the person's thinking?
Yes, sir.
Okay. At the time he got out of the car and was getting out of the car, defendant said the words, these fucking punks, pardon my language, right?
Yes, sir.
And then he followed Trayvon Martin, correct?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Romero asked you a few questions about suffocating. Do you recall being asked questions about that, suffocating?
Yes, sir.
Now, the defendant claims that the victim was suffocating him, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did you find any evidence of blood on the victim's hands?
None that I'm aware of. No, sir.
And there was evidence that the defendant was bleeding, especially on his mouth, right here on his mustache. He had some, right under his nose, he had some blood, correct?
Yes, sir.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor? I'm not going to hit you, but
You hit me. It's
if I can, and I'm hitting you, correct? That's what the defendant's claiming, that I'm suffocating you and I'm not going to put my hand in your mouth.
That's fine.
Would you have your hands like that, just like this? Or would you be fighting me?
I'd be fighting you. I would fighting you. Make sure you got that.
Did you find any blood or anything on the defendant's hands?
No, sir.
You were also asked about witnesses and stuff, and if I may approach the witness again. State Exhibit 140, Mr. Romero showed you this. You recall this? And he asked you in terms of assuming, and I apologize, he may have actually shown you 139. I apologize. Let me take both up so that. 139, he asked you about assuming the defendant's story is correct in terms of where the altercation had, et cetera.
Yes, sir.
Did you have some evidence that possibly there was something going on behind these houses here, the Bahadur's house?
Yes, sir.
You were asked about the hoodie at the 7-Eleven. I'm not aware of, but what law states that an individual can't go into a 7-Eleven with a hoodie? Is there some law that I missed?
No, sir.
I haven't voted on it. And finally, you did not have the phone records in terms of Trayvon Martin or Rachel Gentile's, right, the lady you did not know he was talking to determine whether it was accurate based on when the defendant's phone finished or not.
No, sir, I did
In other
not.
words, you didn't have the defendant's phone records either, did you?
No, sir.
And I'm talking about in the February 29th interview. I apologize.
I was assuming that, yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. You know, we've been here almost 2 hours this morning on cross, redirect, recross, re-redirect, and now you're seeking to re-recross. I will give you 5 minutes. It's the state's witness, and the state will then have another 5 minutes on redirect.
Sorry, Your Honor, there's just new areas gone into it, I have to address them.
Well, you have 5 minutes
I will take it.
for your
Hopefully less.
recross.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, as far as any blood on Mr. Zimmerman's hands, of course, when he got to you, he was already cleaned up by EMTs and he had washed himself at SPD, correct?
Yes, sir.
You wouldn't expect to find blood on his hands at that point, would you?
No, sir.
And when the suggestion is, why didn't Trayvon Martin have blood on his hands, is blood susceptible to gravity as well? Like
Yes, sir, it
other
is.
things? So if he gets smashed in the nose and is thrown on the ground, which way is the blood going?
Towards the ground, and
And back down his throat?
back down his throat,
Right?
or,
And only when he stands up is it going to start coming out of his nostrils?
yes, sir.
Which is after he's no longer being mounted by Trayvon Martin?
Typically, yes, sir.
Okay, so break my nose, put me on the ground, my blood's going backwards into my throat, right?
Theoretically, yes.
And would not be available to be on Trayvon Martin's hands at that point because there was no blood outside the nose, correct?
Correct.
And I'm not going to approach you like he did, but basically, first of all, let's use the left, if he's holding him down, could that be literally momentary, that he's holding him down and that Mrs. Zimmerman is trying to get back up?
Yes, sir.
And could the attempt to suffocate literally be momentary as well?
Yes, sir.
Could it even be a sleeve or an arm or a palm or anything that could have given Mr. Zimmerman that impression?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. You have,
I think I'm only going to ask 2 or 3 questions.
thank you.
May only ask one. Right now, it could be raining outside, right?
Yes, sir.
And that would be pure speculation on your part, would it not?
Yes, it would.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Officer Serino, you're excused from the courtroom, but you're subject to being recalled. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll take a 15-minute recess. If you'll please put your notepads face down on the chairs and follow the deputy back into the jury room.
As they walked out, you didn't release until somebody... Thank you. Sorry.
Please be seated, and I did tell him it was subject to being recalled. Is there anything we need to take up before we recess for 15 minutes?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
I have a motion I'm filing at this point, Your Honor. It certainly doesn't need to be addressed right this minute.
Okay.
But it's in response to a motion the state filed yesterday. I don't know if they've noticed it for hearing or not.
I haven't received any notices for hearing, but we'll go ahead and take your motion.
Thank you.
We'll be in recess. be seated. Court is in session. Are we ready for bring the jury in and your next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. Will you call Mark Osterman?
Well, we have to get the jury in first. That's okay. Let's go ahead and bring the jury in. Oh. Trish.
Jury's present, Your Honor.
Please be seated. And please call your next witness.
State would call Mark Osterman.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that your testimony in these proceedings will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
You may, yes, you may.
You state your name for the record, please, sir.
Mark Osterman,
And could you spell your last name?
Osterman.
And do you work for a federal agency, sir?
Yes, I do, the Federal Air Marshal Service,
Okay. How long have you been so employed?
since December of 2001.
Okay. Do you know a person by the name of George Zimmerman?
Very well.
Okay. And is he seated here in the courtroom today?
Yes, he is.
See, the person just stood up.
Yes, he is.
Your Honor, the record reflect the witness identified defendant, George Zimmerman.
The record will so reflect.
And how long have you known him approximately?
At least 5 years.
Okay. And you knew him back in February of 2012, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And would you consider him a very good friend?
Best friend I've ever had.
Okay. I want to draw your attention to February 26th, February 27th, the evening of February 26th, 27th. Did you get a call and you end up responding to the retreat at Twin Lakes?
I did.
And did you meet the defendant's wife, Shelley Zimmerman, there?
I did.
Okay. Later the following morning, early morning of the 27th, did you come into contact with the defendant, George Zimmerman?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And did you transport him somewhere with his wife, Shelley Zimmerman?
I did.
Okay. Did he make some statements to you regarding what he alleged happened regarding the shooting he was involved in?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And did he specifically state that that Sunday night, the 26th, he had was going shopping at Target?
Correct.
We object, Your Honor, leading.
Okay. If you could, tell us what the defendant told you, and let me set the setting if I could. You were with yourself, and I believe you were driving, is that correct?
I drove myself.
Okay.
You
I
explained
apologize.
before.
I've got to rephrase the
Go
question.
ahead.
I apologize, confused on my part. When Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, was telling you something about what happened, he was in the car with you, is that correct?
That is correct.
And were you driving?
I was.
And was his wife, Shelley Zimmerman, in the car with you and him?
She was.
Okay. And did he make some statements regarding what had happened regarding the shooting?
He did.
Okay, if you could tell us what the defendant said regarding what he alleged happened.
George said that on that Sunday night, he had left his home, as he did every Sunday night, to get lunches for the week. And as he was going to go to Super Target, which is really, really close to his home, he was going to, he just drives out of his neighborhood, and I think it was dark that night. And on his way there is when he observed someone in a black hoodie and someone who was looking like someone he had not seen before. And he knew most of the people in his neighborhood. So he had observed someone walking through the neighborhood with a hoodie on, looking either into windows or looking into around residences and such.
All right, let me interrupt you if I could. Did he describe the individual, he said?
He did.
How did he describe him?
Tall, about 6 foot, and about slender,
Okay.
slender build.
And he stated the person was doing something, you said?
He said as walking through between two sets of townhomes, when you look to your left and right, you would look into windows. You wouldn't be in a position really to look into either the front door or such, but it was side windows.
Yes, sir. Did he further describe the individual by race or ethnicity?
Well, at that time, he knew that he was a black male.
Okay. I apologize, I interrupted you. You said, what else did the defendant tell you regarding what happened?
He said then when he realized that the person that was walking through the neighborhood was someone he didn't know, he didn't recognize, and someone who usually looks through a neighborhood while it's raining, it's suspicious, because a lot of times juveniles will walk through neighborhoods, or people who are suspicious will walk through neighborhoods while it's raining because you get less people walking around, walking their dogs, or just taking an evening walk. So someone who might want to be a little more suspicious, if they're acting suspicious, they'll do it when it's dark and when it's raining. And that might have been a trigger, he had said to me.
All right, okay. What I want to do is focus as best you can in terms of what you recall him saying as opposed to...
I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, he said he observed what is now, we realize is Trayvon, walking between the two buildings, and then he came down and he observed him, thought it was suspicious, and then he was going to call the non-emergency number for the Sanford Police Department.
Did he state that the individual that we're referring now as Trayvon Martin starts toward him and came under the light, and so he was using his phone?
Correct. George was using his, I'm sorry, did you mention George was using his phone or Trayvon?
What did he say?
I was never told by George that Trayvon was using his phone.
I'm sorry, that
George was.
George, I apologize.
Correct.
George Zimmerman was using his phone.
Correct. He dialed the non-emergency number, and he wanted to make sure that he called that line instead of the 911 line.
Did he say, the person you know now as the victim, Trayvon Martin, approached this car?
Walked close at this point.
Okay, what does he say about that, if you could?
Walked down to the street, about where, because George had remained in his vehicle, and Trayvon had walked down, I guess down to the sidewalk area, walked a little further away, walked back a bit, and then George had, I believe, pulled into the front of their clubhouse and parked his vehicle there and waited for Sanford Police to arrive and
Okay, does he say, I apologize, I interrupted you, sir.
No, I'm sorry, just...
Okay, did he say that the person you now know is Trayvon Martin? When I say he, I'm talking about the defendant, George Zimmerman.
Right.
That he walked up to the passenger side window and stood there for a moment, then goes to the front of the car, comes around to my window on my driver's side, then towards the rear of my car, then walks away?
Yeah, it was walked around the vehicle, very in close proximity, and I think they looked at each other, George had said.
Okay. Did he, the defendant, then say that at some point then he lost sight of the person you now know as Trayvon Martin?
Yes, briefly.
And do you recall then in terms of Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, saying that he was talking to the dispatch or to the non-emergency person, correct?
Yes.
And did he tell you that in terms of whether he was asked, are you following him, and he answered, yes, I'm following him, but he didn't see Trayvon Martin at that time, was looking for him?
Well, there's kind of two, as George described it to me, there were kind of two phases of the contact. The first one was when he first saw him, and then he pulled into the clubhouse parking lot, and then the second one was when he reestablished contact with Trayvon, who walked down another side street that wasn't the main street around the circle, and then he backed his car up, and then he tried to keep a visual contact with him, so he followed him with his car, and he didn't get out of his vehicle until he lost visual sight of him.
And then do you recall the defendant telling you that the officer or the dispatcher, I use officer just because they're with the police department, saying to the defendant that we don't need you to follow him, and he said okay?
Correct. That was at the point where he had already gotten out of his car first, And as he described to me, was there were two reasons for getting out of the car. First, he didn't know the street, I guess he was on that center street, it's a smaller street. He didn't know the actual name of it, so he got out of his car to try to establish a visual contact, to try to direct the police officer in to meet with Trayvon and dispel his suspicions, and to find the exact address. Because as a police officer, you always want to know the exact address of where you're going.
All right, and then he told you, I'm sorry, the defendant, I apologize for using pronoun, that he started walking and then he put his phone somewhere?
He put his phone in his pocket after the dispatcher told him they didn't need him to follow him, so he was going to walk back to his vehicle.
Okay, and then he said something happened at that point?
He told me that as he was walking back to his car down the dog path, that Trayvon had confronted him, had walked towards him and confronted him, and they had a verbal.
Okay, and what do you recall a defendant telling you that Trayvon Martin told him, and what did he say in response?
He cursed. I'm not going to curse here today. He said, do you have a problem? And then he used a curse word.
All right, now, you wrote a book about this, right?
I did.
And you wrote a book and where you quoted what the defendant, George Zimmerman, told you, correct?
Correct.
And do you recall in that book writing, do you have a problem that that's what he said, Trayvon Martin said?
Right. Correct.
Okay. And you didn't put in that book anything about a curse word at all?
I believe I did.
You did? Okay.
I believe I did. Do you have a problem? And then he used the initials MF.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, I may.
I'm going to show you your own book. And unless I got the wrong page, I'm on page 28, counsel. Just to refresh your memory.
Correct. Correct.
And don't read from it, this is to refresh your memory.
All right. Yeah, he had told me that, do you have a problem? And then the curse word, it was taken out of the book because it was pretty graphic. And I didn't
Oh,
know-
okay, so you on purpose you took it out?
I think the publisher had
Okay.
asked that not be put in.
Because you put on there, do you have a problem? And then Mr. Zimmerman, that you said, replied, no, I don't have a problem.
Correct. And it said-
But you believe the words were actually what now, the defendant said?
MF.
Okay, so these juries have heard, so just for the record to be
Okay,
clear.
I just
He
don't-
said, do you have a problem, motherfucker?
Correct.
Okay. And then the defendant, Mr. Zimmerman, said in reply, no, I don't have a problem. And then Mr. Trayvon Martin replied?
You do now.
Okay. And the defendant claimed that Trayvon Martin was coming at him at that time?
He was very close, probably within an arm's or 2 arms reach.
Okay.
And George lost contact
And-
visually.
And I apologize.
Okay.
I
I'm sorry, go
interrupted
ahead.
you.
Go right ahead. No, he, as George was reaching down to get to his phone to reestablish contact with the dispatch, that's when physical contact happened.
So the defendant told you that he has these words with Trayvon Martin,
Correct.
and then he said that he went and reached for his phone in his pocket.
Correct? Looked down.
I'm sorry, he looked down.
He looked down to reach to get into his pocket,
And at that point is when Trayvon Martin hits him?
struck him in the nose.
Okay. So the defendant claims he looked down, and that's when Trayvon Martin hit him.
Well, he looked down, got his phone, and he said as he looked back up, he lost visual contact for maybe a second. To get his phone out of his pocket, he went like this, and as he looked up, the punch came squarely in his face.
So the defendant say he took the phone out or left it in his pocket?
I don't remember that.
Okay.
I don't remember.
And then what did the defendant claim after he claims the victim hit him in the nose?
He stumbled backwards and found himself on his back,
Okay.
partially on the grass, partially on the sidewalk.
Did he say what the victim, Trayvon Martin, was doing at that point?
He moved forward and got on top of him.
Did he describe to you how he got on top of him?
His knees were up somewhere near his chest or up near his armpits,
Okay.
and he was beginning to punch him.
Okay, so the defendant is claiming that the victim straddled him, I guess?
Correct?
And his knees were up in his ribs and near his armpits, correct?
Correct.
and he began punching him.
That's what George said.
And I apologize, he began punching Trayvon Martin. Okay.
Trayvon began punching George Zimmerman.
I'm sorry, I got it backwards, sorry. The defendant's claiming he's on the ground,
And
Trayvon Martin is straddling him.
Was punching him,
And-
George. I'm sorry.
I apologize, Mr. Officer.
I'm sorry. He said that he was on his back, and Trayvon Martin straddled him and began punching him in the face.
But the way he described Trayvon Martin straddling the defendant, he claims that you said his knees were up to his rib cage or armpits, is that correct?
Somewhere around there, correct.
Yes, sir. Then he said, what?
Well, George began screaming for help at that point.
Did he say anything about the defendant grabbing his head and doing something with his head?
Absolutely. Once he started screaming, George said Trayvon grabbed his head and started bashing his head on the concrete, which his upper half of his body was on the dog path.
Right. In fact, I think you quoted Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, saying that he was 8 inches from the grass, correct?
About, as George was explaining it, this upper half of him, somewhere of this where it was still on the concrete, where the rest of his body was on the grass.
And I think your quote is, I noticed that I'm about 8 inches away from the grass, correct?
Correct.
And then does Mr. Zimmerman, defendant, tell you that I tried to maneuver the body just enough to get my head onto the grass?
It was a squirm, he said. He said as he was squirming down towards the grass to keep his head from getting hit by the concrete, he says his jacket kind of remained still as you squirm. His jacket, since it wasn't buttoned, it stayed where it was, and his body moved towards the grass a little bit more.
What else did he say about anybody seeing this or coming out?
He said there were several people that came out, at least 2 that he saw that came out, and he directly screamed for help towards those people. So as he was screaming, it was more directed at someone.
And did he say one of the individuals that came out was a man, and he yelled directly at him, and the man just went right back in?
He stated he was going to call 911 and he wasn't going to get involved.
And did he say then there was other individuals that saw this too, correct?
Perhaps at least one other, for sure, that witnessed what was happening. It may have been the same person that had the flashlight
Right.
that showed up later.
I think you can refer, if you need to refresh your memory, on page 28 where you quoted Mr. Zimmerman. Did you not, at the very bottom of page 28 of your book?
There were several people.
I think you said 2 other men saw us out there and did nothing,
Correct.
correct?
I believe so. At least one other, maybe 2 others.
And then he claimed that Mr. Martin, or Trayvon Martin, was still on top of him and took his hands and put it over his nose, correct?
One hand was trying to cover his nose, one hand was trying to cover his mouth to keep him from screaming.
Right, and I think you quoted Mr. Zimmerman as saying that Trayvon Martin put his hand, takes one of his hands and puts it over my nose and pinches it closed while his other hand goes over my mouth.
It was described to me something like this, maybe a pinch, maybe not like that, but a pinch like that and a cover.
So, in other words, Trayvon Martin is using one hand over his nose and then one hand over his mouth, correct?
It's something to that effect.
And then, what does Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, say happened then?
He said that because his jacket rode up a bit, that perhaps with the inside of his leg, he felt or looked down and saw that he had a holster and a firearm.
Okay. Before the defendant said that, did he say that he desperately got both of my hands around the guy's one wrist and took his hand off my mouth long enough for me to shout again for help?
Right. That was the main thing he did with his hands, was to try to clear his mouth. Because with his mouth free, he could scream and he could breathe.
Okay. So the defendant is describing to you that Trayvon Martin's got one hand pinching or with his nose, and then he's got the other hand over his mouth, right? Where he can't breathe or
Correct.
Have I got that right?
Correct.
And then the defendant is claiming that he took his hands and removed at least one hand off of Trayvon Martin?
off of his own mouth.
Okay. Defendant's claiming that he never hit Trayvon Martin at that time, or never just knocked him off of him, right?
That was not described to me.
Okay. And then the defendant told you he had a brief control of the wrist, but then he said, I knew when he felt the sidearm at my wrist with his leg, correct?
Say that one more time, sir?
For a brief moment, I had control of the wrist, but I knew when he felt the sidearm at my wrist with his leg.
That's when he, right. That's when he let go of the other hand let go, and he said that he went for the gun.
Okay. Did he
Grabbed
say
for it.
Trayvon Martin went for the gun, correct?
Grabbed for the gun.
Okay. And I think you quoted him as saying he took his hand that was covering my nose and went for the gun, saying something at that point, correct?
He did.
He said, what words did he utter?
He says, you're going to die, and he used the MF term again. I'm sorry, I don't like to curse in front of ladies.
And for the record, he used the word, you're going to die now, motherfucker, correct?
That is correct.
And then I think you got the defendant quoted as saying, somehow I broke his grip on the gun when the guy grabbed it between the rear sight and the hammer, correct?
Could have been the leather, could have been the gun.
Well, I think you quoted him on page 29, and refresh your memory if you need to,
Correct.
as, under quotations, somehow I broke his grip on the gun when the guy grabbed it between the rear sight and the hammer, so...
That's where the leather strap is, though. That's what holds the gun in.
So the defendant is claiming that the victim actually grabbed the gun,
That was my understanding, that he grabbed the gun. That would have been the only place that was available to grab.
And then he said the defendant, managed to get the gun in his hand and raised it towards Trayvon Martin's chest and pulled the trigger, correct?
Unfortunately, yes.
And then he claims after he shot Trayvon Martin, that Trayvon Martin sat up and he heard him say, you got it, okay, you got it, something like that.
Correct.
And then the Trayvon Martin pivoted 90 degrees and fell face forward onto the grass, and he scooted from under him.
Correct.
And the defendant claims he didn't know he shot him.
He didn't know he struck him, correct.
I'm sorry, struck him.
Correct.
In fact, the defendant went on to tell you that he thought Trayvon Martin, I know he wasn't calling him Trayvon Martin.
I understand.
I think he referred to him as the guy or whatever, might try to get up again, so after putting his gun back in the holster, he jumped on top of Trayvon Martin and pinned him down, correct?
Correct.
And then he said a man approached him out of the darkness and
First
thought it was
man
the
was
police,
not.
correct?
First man was not a police officer. The second was.
And you recall also that when he's describing in terms of the first contact he had out there when he was calling the non-emergency number, that he said, we need you to get to a place where you can see him in terms of observing Trayvon Martin?
Right, well, that's, he had said that he had to get somewhere where he could observe Trayvon or observe any subject that's in his neighborhood to be able to direct police officers to them. So whether he actually, whether the dispatch actually said, we need you to move to where you can see them, I'm not sure if that actually was what occurred, but he had said that his instructions from Sanford Police, whenever they came to their complex, was always to get to where you can observe and try not to make contact.
And he told you that the officer was almost there at the scene in about 45 seconds or something, or the dispatcher's telling him that, correct?
Well, I guess time is relative at that point, but yes, very, very shortly after.
I'm saying, when he's talking, he's saying the dispatcher's telling him the officer's almost there, he's
Correct.
within 45 seconds.
Correct.
And he told you that, and I'm going back now in terms of when the dispatcher, he tells you that he told the dispatcher to just have the officer meet me at the clubhouse, correct?
That is correct.
And that he put his phone in his pocket to turn around to head back to the car when the guy is there about 15 feet away from walking towards him, right?
Correct.
So he's saying that Trayvon Martin, I apologize, I'm using the name Trayvon Martin, but you know who I'm talking about.
Correct.
He's describing this person's 15 feet away and walking towards him, correct?
Correct.
And he says, do you have a problem? And then what occurs? You said he said some other words, MF, but you didn't put it in the book, correct?
Correct.
He also told you that when he managed to get his hand off of Trayvon Martin's hands off his mouth, that he had control of the wrist, correct?
To some degree, to prevent him from putting it back over his mouth, yes.
Right. And he told you that the defendant managed to break the grip on the gun where the guy grabbed it between the rear side and the hammer, correct?
Whether it was the gun or the leather casing, or just reaching down there and grabbing something.
Right, but I think,
Broke the grip of the gun or the holster.
now, you didn't refer to the holster when you wrote it down in the book, correct? You just put gun.
Correct.
Right.
Because the holsters, that's exactly the place where the holster holds the firearm in place. So whether it was actual firearm or holster, I didn't see a difference. If someone grabs a hold of the holster or grabs a hold of the gun, their intent is probably the same.
And the defendant's telling you then that he shot at Trayvon Martin, but he didn't know whether he struck him or not. He thought
Correct.
the shot went wide, correct?
He did say that.
Let me have a moment, Your Honor. I don't have any further questions.
Thank you, Cross.
Yes, thank you. Morning, sir, how are you?
Fine, sir.
How long have you been in law enforcement?
Since 1992,
Okay. Pretty much a career for you?
it is.
And do you enjoy doing what you do?
Very much.
Did you get any college training or anything before going to the police academy?
Well, not before the police academy. I had, right out of high school, I went into the Army. I was in the U.S. Army Infantry, and when I got out, I then applied directly to the Daytona Beach Community College Police Academy.
Completed that and then been in law enforcement ever since?
Correct.
And you've discussed your career with George Zimmerman, have you not?
In detail.
And it was actually you who assisted him when he decided that he needed a firearm, correct?
That is correct.
And did he tell you the reason why he wanted to get a firearm?
He asked whether he should or shouldn't to start with,
Okay.
and I recommended that he should, that anybody who's a non-convicted felon should carry a firearm.
That's your sort of life philosophy?
That's my opinion, correct.
Being armed is better than not being armed?
The police aren't always there.
And you then encouraged him to do that?
I told him if he wished to go to a place that actually trains for the concealed weapons permit and to get that training.
Which you know that he did, right?
He did do.
And that he actually got his concealed weapons permit?
I believe him and his wife.
And then they need to decide what weapon that they should, or he should purchase, correct?
That is correct.
And did he seek your counsel in that regard?
He did.
And
Object is to beyond the scope of direct.
Sustained.
let's focus then a bit more. How long did you know George?
About 5 years, or at that time it was about 4 years at that time.
Okay. And I think you said he's your best friend?
Best friend I've ever had.
Would that affect in any way your testimony here today, that he's a good friend of yours?
Well, not as far as the truth is.
Okay. So you're going to speak the truth, good or bad, for Mr. Zimmerman.
Correct.
And as part of that friendship, you were contacted on the night that this event happened?
I was.
Okay. And offered your help when, and I guess helped Shelley, who was going through what she was going through, right?
Near hysterical. She had called me she was visiting her father's home at the time when she received a call from a neighbor from Twin Lakes. And then she immediately called me. And both of us got into our vehicle and arrived at Twin Lakes about within 10 seconds of each other.
And how upset was she?
Indescribably hysterical. She had almost no information to go on because the neighbor, I guess, that called, they had to hang up. So she couldn't get further updates as to George's health or status or what he had. She was, I put my arm around her just to kind of keep her from blacking out, I guess.
Because at that point, she had gotten a phone call from somebody who actually said that George was involved in a shooting, correct?
She told me that she got a call that said George was involved in a shooting, in handcuffs and bloody.
So you arrive at the area, the complex where it happened, meet with Shelley.
Correct.
Did you see George at that point?
We walked up to where the yellow crime scene tape was that was surrounded. It was a massive area that they had circled off, so we couldn't get very close to the actual scene itself. But inside the crime scene tape was a Stanford police officer car. In the back seat of the police officer car, Shelley and I saw someone who she more quickly identified as probably being George lean his head down and lay down from the back seat. And he supposedly he had laid straight down to where no one could see him.
And did you have any contact with him at that point?
None. Couldn't get anywhere close.
Okay. Then at some point you went to Sanford Police Department, correct?
Correct. I drove Shelley over to the Sanford Police Department and we waited in their lobby until he was released.
Do you recall about how many hours you were there?
Goodness. 2 or 3 a.m., could have been even longer.
What was his state of mind when you finally saw him at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning?
Stunned. He immediately attempted to reassure Shelley, who broke down again once she saw him. Once they got out of the elevator, she went into hysterics, kind of a breakdown, maybe not hysterics, but went into a sobbing breakdown. And he immediately tried to reassure her he was okay, and so he was more occupied with her than with anything else, but he had a stunned look on his face.
And when you say stunned, tell me.
Wide-eyed, just kind of a little bit detached, perhaps from maybe not realizing he had just gone through a traumatic event. Kind of odd to describe, very, very difficult to describe it.
Let's talk about, obviously, as a good friend for him for the 5 years prior, or 4 years prior, you've known him, correct?
Oh, yes.
And then tell the jury, if you would, how he was that night compared to the George Zimmerman you knew most other days.
That's what I was using to base my observation on, was a more wide-eyed stare. Again, once he saw Shelley, he focused more on making sure she was reassured and that letting her know that he's okay, he doesn't have anything fatal or anything going on with him. He's all right. And she immediately started to observe. Once she got out of her shock at seeing George, she then started kind of looking at his injuries, and I guess she kind of went into nurse mode at that point because she was a nursing student.
And again, how is George presenting himself to you?
Detached. It's hard to describe.
Well, is detached different from the way he normally is?
Oh, vastly.
So when you say detached, what do you mean?
I would say probably when you feel like it's hard to describe, sir. I would say he was probably in a position where he was not able to process, his mind wasn't, he wasn't answering questions, because I started asking him some questions about whether he needed to sit down for a little bit, right there in the lobby, and he didn't. He just, no, I just want to go, I just want to go home kind of thing. And it was very basic. I don't know how to really describe detached, as in wide-eyed and really not processing what was going on.
Did he seem to you to be non-emotional about what was going on?
Coming right off of the elevator, well, he was tending to Shelley and her sobbing, and her crying. So he was focused with that. When that went down, when Shelley actually transformed from a wife concerned for her husband to being a nurse, that's when he kind of just kind of had a blank stare.
And then at some point you guys got in the car, correct?
Went to my vehicle, correct?
And then let's talk about the conversations that he did have with you. So give us the setting, if you would, as to how this conversation that at some point in the future you relayed as far as your direct examination. So sort of give us the setting for what happened.
Okay. We get into my vehicle. Both Shelley and George got into the back seat. I had a four-door vehicle. They both got in the back seat, and Shelley is trying to put an assessment on the injuries that were to George's nose, the back of his head, and he had a swelling on his left side of his head. It was about the size of your fist. It was a swollen area, not really a goose egg, not as pronounced as that, but it was a very big swollen area. I'm sorry. And with his head being his hair being closely cropped like mine, you could see it very well. I guess if he had a lot more hair, he would not have been able to see it as well. But she started tending to that, stating that we needed to get ice on it and such. And when we got stating that she needed to get ice on that part of the swelling, and on the drive from the Sanford Police Department to my home, he explained from start to finish. It took about the whole time that we went from the Sanford Police Department to my home. He explained what had happened that night, because that was the first time we had known any details of anything.
Now, as he was explaining it to you, was this sort of as a friend recounting to a friend, or were you acting in law enforcement mode or as friend mode?
Well, my wife will tell you it's hard for me to get out of law enforcement mode sometimes, but I like to analyze everything I hear to make sure that it makes sense. But I would say part of his friend also.
Okay. So let's start off then, not to belabor too much with keeping in mind your direct testimony, but let's start with, he first told you he was on his way to Super Target?
Correct.
Does that seem usual or unusual to you?
Every single Sunday like clockwork.
And tell me what he said to you about him first noticing who later became known to all of us as Trayvon Martin.
He observed Trayvon walking between two sets of townhomes and looking into, I believe there was a window to one where the light was on, and you could see that someone was looking into the window of a townhome. And it was about that time that Trayvon and George made eye contact with each other, and both aware of the other's presence.
Okay. And in that initial contact, did he seem to you as though he was angry or anything like that with who this person was?
No. George said that he wanted to make sure that he just got with non-emergency dispatch and had them send a police officer.
And he told you he did that?
Immediately.
And of course, you know from your conversation with George that that entire conversation was recorded, correct?
Yes, I do.
And from your conversations with George, both about this night and other nights, George Zimmerman certainly knows that those phone calls are recorded, correct?
Yes.
So tell me then, again, he's explained to you that Trayvon Martin is now walking up and sort of near his vehicle at some point?
Correct. Came walking from between the townhomes down to where the sidewalk or the road area was.
And are you taking any notes at this point, or are you just listening to him download?
I'm driving.
Okay. So at some point it became apparent to you that Mr. Zimmerman had stopped his car by the clubhouse, correct?
Yes, he did.
And that Trayvon Martin then came up towards his car, either looked in a window or walked partially around it?
Very close, walked around it, very close. They made eye contact several more times, very aware of each other's presence.
During this point, this sort of second eye contact, did George Zimmerman relate to you in any way that he was angry or anything about Trayvon Martin or this person who was there?
No, not at all.
And he further told you that he was still on the phone, of course, with non-emergency, right?
He remained on, correct.
So then we move forward to, I think you said that George Zimmerman did what he thought he should to keep Trayvon Martin in sight?
Correct.
Is that pretty much the way? Tell me how he related that part to you, as best you can recall.
Well, he said that he had heard from the Sanford police officers that showed up to the clubhouse to give instruction to neighborhood watch people was to always try to keep whatever subject that you're observing in sight. It makes it much easier for a law enforcement officer to show up and make contact with the subject if you're on the phone with dispatch during the whole process and you can actually see the subject.
Did he relate to you that the non-emergency dispatcher had actually told him on a couple of occasions, tell me what he's doing now or let me know if he's doing anything else?
He told me what he was doing. He didn't tell me that the dispatcher had said certain things.
Okay. So basically, George Zimmerman, as he's telling you this story, is recounting to you actions, correct?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Not necessarily, I did this because of this reason, or I did this, and sort of superimposing the conversation he's having with the non-emergency onto your conversation.
No, not at that time, no.
Okay. He was just saying basically a rendition of what was going on.
Correct.
And just so the jury is clear, about how long was this conversation between George Zimmerman and you during this car ride?
The drive from the Sanford Police Department to near the intersection of Reinhardt Road and Lake Mary Boulevard, which would have been about 14 minutes, 15 minutes.
And during that time, were other things being discussed as well, like whatever Shelley was doing with him?
She didn't interject at all.
Okay. So during this conversation then, he's telling you that he's trying to keep an eye on Trayvon Martin however he can.
That was his intent,
Okay.
was to keep him under observation.
And at some point, well, tell me then, at some point did he say to you that I couldn't see him any longer, or that he lost sight of him?
That is one of the reasons why he got out of the vehicle.
And tell me how he related that to you?
He said he went in between the sets of townhomes down a dog path, a walking path.
When you say he, you mean Trayvon Martin?
What? Right. He lost contact in the darkness in between the townhomes down that walking path, and then he got out of his vehicle it may have been at the time when someone was asking him, where's your exact location, because the officer was getting close. So as the police officer gets closer and closer to the actual scene, the dispatch likes to tell them exact street numbers so you can find your place exactly.
Okay.
So that's what he was looking for.
George Zimmerman never told you during the entire of this conversation that George Zimmerman ever went down the dog path, correct?
He did. He left his vehicle and he
walked down the path.
Walked down the path, correct.
Do you know this area that we're talking about?
I do.
Okay. You know there's a path that goes straight through to a Retreat View Circle?
Correct.
And then a right turn that goes off to the right?
Correct.
A T.
Yes.
And he had said to you that Trayvon Martin went down the T, correct?
Perhaps, yes. That's what he believes, because the street beyond was lit better than the dog path was. So if Trayvon had gone all the way to Retreat View Circle, he would have seen him or his shadow, perhaps. Because he lost sight of him around the time where the T was, he said, I believe he made his turn down that dark dog path area that was not very well lit at all.
And tell us the path, if you recall, that George Zimmerman told you he took as he was on the phone.
He said he went straight to go through since he lost contact. He wanted to go straight through to get a house number of one of the... Straight through, not take the right to go down on the T, just to go straight through. and find some kind of a house number, because you want to make sure you get the exact house number, because there was a lot of units there on Retreat View Circle. The exact house number would have brought the police officer faster. I believe that's what his intent was.
And he told you he was on his way back when the altercation began, correct?
Correct.
And that they said whatever they said to each other that you testified to. Just to fast forward, I think you said that you weren't taking notes during that event, correct?
I was driving, correct.
Have you ever talked to George again about the facts of this case, or was that the only time?
One other time, I heard him relay the incident,
And when was that?
the next morning.
Okay, and we'll talk about that in a moment.
Okay.
During the event in the car, when he said things like, do you have a problem, you do now, or no, I don't, are those, as best you can recall, the words that George told you he remembers from the night before?
That is correct.
And talking about the actual mounting, when he said that Trayvon Martin had mounted him, I think he said that at one point he was straddling and the knees may have been up as high as the armpits. Is that correct?
Could have been. The ribs area could have been as high as the armpits.
Well, no, I'm just asking you, because what I would like to do is have you tell the jury, without presuming or suggesting ribs, armpits, hips, knees, whatever it might be, for right now, just recount, as best you recall, what George remembered of the event and what he told you.
Well, I guess during the struggle, I guess the position of his knees and legs would probably change with George squirming. So at one point, I believe they were around his ribs, with George trying to squirm off of the sidewalk and onto the grass. I guess his knees came up a little higher, and that's very possible. Or the other way around, to where it was, as he's squirming, once they get closer to the grass, in a fight, I guess, or in a scrap like that, it began, at least, here with the ribs, with the knees are somewhere in the ribs area.
Was he consistent, however, that it was Trayvon Martin who had mounted on top of him?
If it was Trayvon
Was it-
that did
yes.
it? Oh, absolutely.
And was he consistent that it was he, meaning George Zimmerman, who was screaming for help?
Without question.
And he did tell you at some point that there was some hand over the nose, hand over the mouth event?
Correct. But it was raining and it was slippery, I'm sure.
Did he tell you how long that portion of the overall altercation lasted?
20 seconds maybe, 15, 20, 30 seconds?
Did he-
He didn't mention it.
Well, again, I don't want you to
No, he didn't mention
assume.
it. He did not say how long.
Okay. Did that, however, as he related it to you, seem to be significant as it was occurring to him, that he couldn't breathe for whatever length of time?
Yeah, it was critical.
And that somebody had a hand, Trayvon Martin, on the nose that had already suffered the previous injury?
Correct.
And as he was relating that to you, was that sort of a real focus of his?
That was the focus. That when he was losing oxygen, he felt he was not able to breathe, and that's why he was desperate to either clear an airway.
And in your experience as law enforcement, would you agree that that's sort of a natural reaction to traumatic events?
I would think so, every time I've seen it.
And do people involved in traumatic events like that sometimes focus on particular parts of it?
Almost exclusively to the omission of others.
For example, in a car accident, you might focus on the speed of the car coming at you and completely forget about other cars around you.
Correct.
Is that unnatural in your experience as law enforcement?
No, it's typical.
So when you go to a scene of an accident or shooting or just anything that you investigate, do you find in your experience that people often have sort of tunnel vision views of what happened to them?
Sometimes very specific, correct.
Does that mean that they're lying to you when they do that?
Not at all.
Why not?
It's been proven that is typical. Sometimes they'll focus in on one event to the exclusion of others.
How about their ability to just recount events with any particularity at all?
I'm going to object this beyond the scope of direct. I haven't objected previously.
And then you testified concerning this whole event around the gun. Did you have a similar concern as to Mrs. Zimmerman's ability to recount those events to you?
No.
Okay. Tell me what he did say about having to grab his gun.
He said that Trayvon had reached down and grabbed for the gun, whether it was on the leather holster or on the actual metal part itself. At the time, I didn't see a difference. I just thought that the intent was clear, and that's when he had to. He freed one of his hands and went and got the gun. He either broke contact or knocked somebody else's hand away, or Trayvon's hand away from him reaching for the gun or grabbing the gun, and then he drew it.
Do you recall if he even told you that Trayvon Martin had touched the gun, or just that he was reaching for it?
I thought he had said he had grabbed the gun. I've only heard the story twice, and whether it was grabbed the gun, grabbed for the gun, perhaps it was just the intent. But I believed he said he grabbed the gun.
So, and then he told you the rest of the story as you related, correct?
Yes, sir.
About Trayvon Martin sort of saying something to him. Did that seem unusual to you, that someone shot could still say something?
Yes. Oh, no, that's very, very common, unless you're shot in, let's say, the windpipe and in the vocal cords, you would be able to talk for maybe 6 to 8 seconds.
Nonetheless, that George Zimmerman said that he had gotten off and actually held his hands out away from his body?
He had gotten off of George, laid down on the grass, and George had jumped on top of him to pin his hands down and to, again, try to solicit some help from people that are around.
And yet, when he let the hands go, Trayvon Martin may have brought them back under him? Was that the way it was presented to you?
No.
Speculation.
Oh, yeah.
I apologize, I was wrong.
Yeah, no.
Okay. Did he even did George Zimmerman even know to talk to you about the fact that Trayvon Martin's hands were found back under his body?
I did not know that fact.
Okay. So he didn't seem to feel any need to explain that away to you, correct?
Correct.
So now let's talk about your recounting this. Well, you said that you heard a story again the next day.
Next morning.
Any differences in what we've talked about so far?
None.
Okay. And who was that discussed with or in front of?
My wife and his wife, Shelley.
And was it different in any context when it was being discussed then?
George looked different. He was not as wide-eyed, and he did not appear to be as in shock the next morning.
Now, let's fast forward. How many months until you decided to recount this in a book form?
I may have to look. At least 4 months.
Okay. Did you have any conversation with Mr. Zimmerman to corroborate that what you recalled happened, or what you recall him telling you happened, was in fact accurate?
We were not able to contact each other after he was arrested the first time. So there was no contact.
All right. And so you haven't talked to him, you haven't shown him, for example, a draft of the book and say, I remember you saying this, and him saying, no, that I said this instead.
There was no cooperation with that, no.
Yeah. This is your memory 4 months later when you looked back to that night, correct?
Correct.
And just remember it as best you can 4 months later.
Correct.
You didn't take any notes that night?
No.
Or in between, did you?
No.
So it wasn't until 4 months later that you went back, sort of scoured your memory to put back together what he had told you on that night, 2 o'clock in the morning on the 27th.
Unfortunately, I did not take any notes, so it was just memory.
If you had any facts wrong that were conclusively proven wrong by forensic evidence, would you defer to the evidence rather than your memory of it?
Without question.
If, for example, he told you he shot once and there were 4 shots fired, and you had in your book that there was one, but the forensic evidence supported 4, you would defer to that?
I'd support that 100%.
And to the extent that he may have told you something, or you remember he told you something differently than it appears in the non-emergency call, which is recorded contemporaneous with the event, you would defer to that?
Absolutely. I may have heard wrong, or I may have documented it wrong.
And even if there was something different that he told law enforcement a few hours earlier in a recorded or videotaped interview from what you recall happening, would you defer to that?
I would.
A moment, Your Honor. And at some point during this investigation, you had an opportunity to listen to the screaming on the 911 call, correct?
The honest go to direct.
Sustain.
No other questions from me?
Can you redirect?
You, as best you could, have testified and have written in your book what the defendant, your best friend, George Zimmerman, told you, correct?
Correct.
You haven't made anything up to help one side or the other, is that correct?
None whatsoever.
And as you stated, the defendant never told you that the victim had his hands underneath his body after he shot him. He said he put his hands out, right?
Correct.
And as you stated, the defendant told you that the victim, Trayvon Martin, grabbed his gun, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Grabbed for his gun.
Well, I think you've actually,
Grabbed, right, whether it was, again, where I guess we're going over whether it grabbed the holster part or the gun, I didn't see a difference in the two, but grabbed something.
grabbed the gun. He didn't.
Absolutely. The gun didn't come out, but
No.
he grabbed the gun in the holster.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes, sir.
The defendant didn't tell you, Mr. Zimmerman didn't tell you he grabbed for it. He said he actually got it.
That's what I heard, that's what I thought I heard, yes.
Right, okay. Then he told you, I thought I shot wide, but he might get up, so I put my gun in my holster.
Correct.
And he said he put the phone in his pocket, turned around to head back, and the guy was right there about 15 feet walking towards him.
Correct.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Very brief, one question in response. As to the reholstering of the weapon, do you recall if he told you that it was reholstered as he got up, or if he had it in his hand when he was holding Trayvon Martin's hands down, or even at some point shortly thereafter?
He may have had it still in his hand as he jumped on top of Trayvon and perhaps holstered when he saw the flashlight. I don't remember specifically when exactly he holstered his firearm.
Thank you. Nothing further on.
Anything that we redirect?
You wrote in the book that he holstered his firearm.
He holstered his firearm at some point. Exactly when, I'm not 100% sure whether it was when he got up from, whether he stood up and reholstered, or whether he holstered while still partially on top.
All right, you want to look at your book a minute? If you could, page 29 at the bottom. Did you quote him as saying, in fact, I thought he might try to get up again, so after putting my gun in my holster, I jumped on top of him and pinned his wrist to the ground?
Correct.
Okay,
What-
was that accurate?
As far as I remember, that he holstered, yeah, at that point, it now remembers that, I remember that it was, he holstered, pinned his hands down. It's what I remembered him saying something like that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. May Mr. Osterman be excused?
To remain under our subpoena, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. You're excused from the courtroom, but you're subject to being recalled. Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and take a recess for lunch. Before you go to lunch, I'm going to advise you that during lunch, you're not to discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anybody else. You're not to read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case. You're not to go on the internet by using any type of an electronic device to do independent research about the case, people, places, things, or a terminology. And finally, you're not to read or create any emails, text messages, Twitters, tweets, blogs, or social networking pages about the case. Do I have your assurances that you will abide by these instructions? Okay, thank you. And with that, put your notepads face down and follow Deputy Jarvis into the jury room. I didn't say what time we were going to come back, so it'll be 1:30. Anything we need to take up before we recess for lunch? Okay, thank you all very much. We'll be at recess till 1:30.